Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Hello, listeners. I welcome you from the States, from Europe, from South America, from all over the world, from Oz and Neverland, and wherever you're beaming in from. This is the Meditations Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Zlomek, and every other week I have the luxury of bringing somebody on just to share their story and see what we can learn from them. On today's episode, on episode 36, we have Gregory Maguire. Gregory is a New York Times bestselling writer who is most famous for having penned Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, which was turned into a Broadway musical that is still running. In fact, it is the fourth longest running Broadway musical of all time, and it was turned into the biggest movie of right now, the Wicked movie, which you can go out and see in theaters. Gregory is not only a cheerleader for the Wicked Witch of the West and a cheerleader for reading, but is just a fascinating human. I was so overjoyed to talk with him. And in this conversation, we talk about him growing up in Albany, New York, discovering a love of reading at an early age, his sort of compulsion for journaling, which turned into his compulsion for writing, which turned into his compulsion for publishing. We talk about him receiving his PhD in children's fantasy literature from Tufts University, finding inspiration for writing Wicked while he's living in England and struggling with the political climate at the time during Desert Storm. And then the really fun stuff, digging into the creation of the book Wicked, his development of the character Elphaba, and just sort of coming to terms with creating a character or a series of characters that is now part of the cultural lexicon courtesy of the Broadway musical and this magical film that is now in theaters. So I think this is enough of me rambling. Let's head to Oz and elsewhere. Let's hear from Gregory Maguire. Gregory, it's sincerely such an honor to have you on the show. And I want to just start off by thanking the All Things Oz Museum for sort of helping to facilitate this, for which you have made your way to Chittenango, New York, to be there. But I guess starting off with upstate New York in our brains, you grew up in the booming metropolis of Albany, New York. And I was curious, kind of, I wanted to kind of dig into your family dynamics, but like as you reflect on like Albany as a kid, like what was it like to grow up in that town? Like how did the town impact you?
Well, first of all, hi to Chittenango and all the people in that lovely apron of New York farmland and Mohawk Valley glory, which I love. I'm happy to have friends there, and I'm happy to have been there several times. And to answer your question, Albany is or has been through most of the last 150 years an unusually beautiful city because it is the state capital. There was a lot more of New York State imperial money that funneled, up from Manhattan and in from the government to make Albany a suitable state capital with its magnificent uh, four-story state capitol building, perched as it is on a hill on an esplanade above the Hudson River. Many wealthy people lived there, and the housing stock and the famous architects, if you love 19th and 20th century architecture, everybody built in Albany. So for me to grow up there, I had access to a really elegant and um, uh, sort of aesthetically satisfying city to walk around and to call my home. I don't think that's something to be sneezed at. Not every place can be home, and every place can be cherished for its familiarity, but not every place in the world is equally beautiful. And Albany happens to be a very pretty city. Now, even right now, it's going through a few changes because one of the anchors of the city, right in the neighborhood I grew up, the College of St. Rose in Albany, has just had to close its doors. And what that's going to do, it's going to rip the beating heart out of Albany's main residential area. I don't know what that's going to be like in 20 years, but up until now, it's been fairly constant and been fairly preserved from the vicissitudes of the economy going up and down and up and down. It was, I think that's why my parents lived there. They said state governments here, we're always going to be fairly okay. It's not like It's not like the industrial Mohawk Valley, which has had its ups and had its downs, economically. The other thing about Albany, though, is it is a small enough city that once I got permission from my parents to be able to cross streets and, walk halfway downtown and then all the way downtown, what it provided me was access to very good public libraries. This is something that the United States still has hands over almost any other nation in the world access to public libraries in almost every community, however small. Albany public libraries were great, and while I wasn't from a prosperous family and I was from a strict family, I nonetheless had the license of a library card and the permission to wield it for my own benefit through my whole childhood. And I think my mental health and my capacity to be an artist really depends on that and on the fine libraries and schools that helped give me a brain.
Well, thank you for that overview of Albany. I do want to talk a little bit about your sort of family dynamic because it's the stuff of fairy tales, sort of the darker ones there, Gregory. You were born to John and Helen in 1954, and your mother sadly passed away several weeks after you were born. I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about, rather than me spill that off, kind of tell me about your sort of childhood growing up, and then just that sort of family dynamic post the death of your mother.
Well, it's a very good question, and it's the kind of thing that I have been asking myself about my whole life. Uh, I have no memories of saying goodbye to my birth mother, who died when I was 7 days old. Uh, I have no memories of being shunted from one relative's house to another relative's house to the Catholic infant home or orphanage, where I spent a number of months and possibly several years before I was collected by my father and brought back into the family fold. I have no memories of that. I have memories of having a dad and a mommy and brothers and sisters like everybody else on the block. But there was, I concede, a subtle pressure upon my psyche and possibly upon my soul, if you want to call that. Greeks say they're the same thing, but we tend to consider them different aspects of character in the West. Um, the subtle pressure put upon me growing up that said somehow my very existence, my having any thoughts or having any breakfast or having any reservations about anything, is all at the cost of somebody's life. Um, this is a very heavy burden for a child to grow up under. Uh, my parents, my father and his second wife, my stepmother, my second mother, were very, very kind and very good. But life is life, and narrative is narrative, and the facts of my origin story could not be disguised. Nobody lied to me about what had happened, that my mother Helen died when I was born. And in fact, I do believe on some level, my father could not bring himself to cherish me as much as he cherished his other children. I'm not alone in thinking that. My siblings largely thought that was true, that I didn't get the same portion of affection as everybody else in the house. Uh, but I'm a strong person. I just got on with it. It's one of the benefits of being from a big family as well. Everybody's different, and I've got to do my homework. So see you around, and I got on with my life. Uh, but it did make me, I think, particularly attuned to finding characters in literature who seemed to have similar burdens placed upon them. And where do you find that? Well, of course, it's in the Grimm fairy tales. The first paragraph of almost every Grimm fairy tale has to do with a mother and a father who wanted a child more than anything else, and then the child was born and was beautiful, and the mother dies. There's a reason why I have written so much of my adult material based on the fairy tales and the origin stories from fantasies, because they are metaphors for what happens to all of us. I think we all find ourselves in birth even in a loving family of two biological parents who cherish us, we all find ourselves essentially alone. And we have to discover and scrape through to our own identity and find ourselves a way to stand with both feet on the ground, if we're lucky enough to have feet, and make ourselves, introduce ourselves to ourselves and make our own way. A child who loses a parent early on has that more forcefully thrust into their face so that they can't ignore it. But it basically is something that all of us have to have to go through. And so I did.
Well, I think it's just really interesting in the sense that like one of the big sort of criticisms you always hear when I don't know, somebody is critiquing art in general as it's, well, how will children respond to this? How will children
Yeah.
respond to the idea that there's death in the story or whatever? And
Yeah.
you're just kind of preparing for this interview. I'm really excited to talk to you about your love of Harriet the Spy. But like I've been going through like Dear Mr. Henshaw and all these other books that like I loved as a kid, and just realizing that the main thesis of all of them is like you're going to go through something difficult, and there's different ways to alter your perspective and make it through. And I feel like it's just interesting kind of hearing your story and then looking at the way in which you've crafted these narratives that I feel like often have that theme of like, you got to do your homework and the heavy burden can be dealt with later.
Yes. Well, I think that most children understand that life is a lot harder than the parents who love them are willing to admit. The children have to find that out for themselves. And one of the ways they find it out is through their books. Now, we're not as literate a society as we were even 25 years ago, but books are still a way that the truth about existence and about the hardships of being an individual in our culture are presented and are dealt with. And we have that great what's the sense of identification and the catharsis of watching somebody else go through something and survive it. They may not solve it. In fact, if they solve their identity question, they're mistaken because the next one is just going to come up and, present itself, on the first page after the book ends. We are constantly faced with identity questions and with our own moral obligations. But books give us the model that says difficult things can be faced and often survived. Not always, but often.
I love it. Well, thank you for tapping into that. I talked about Harriet the Spy, a few moments ago,
Yeah.
and it's interesting to me. Well, sorry, I'm gonna reframe this, but Harriet the Spy is a book that you sort of fall in love with as a kid, and it spawns your love of journaling, which seems to be a sort of process that you have been regularly exploring for 60 years at this point,
Just about, yeah.
which is.
Almost.
But can you tell us about sort of the discovery of Harriet the Spy in your life and how that tied into your own personal writing?
Well, as I said to you, I was given the liberty of the library, and I mostly sought out books that were fantasies. Now, this was before I knew what a fantasy was, or that there was such a thing as a genre. I just called them magic books, books in which magic happened, as opposed to school stories or sports stories or mysteries set in the past. I wasn't really sure magic didn't exist anyway. So, magic was just one of the things that happened in books. And I didn't think of them as fantasies. But Harriet the Spy was almost the only book from childhood that I absolutely cherished that had no pretense of having a magic door or a casement window that one could fly through or disappear behind and find oneself secretly in a private world. Harriet is in the private world of her own imagination and her own very steely consciousness. She is not like a lot of kids, particularly a moral player in her world. She's a little bit devious and she's a little bit unformed, but what she is intellectually curious. And she uses a marble covered notebook and a pen to write down her observations of what she sees in the Upper East Side of New York and to puzzle out questions that occur to her. Some of them are somewhat intellectual, some of them are just observational questions, like what does that lady feel like when she looks in her mirror and sees that big zit on her nose? Um, and I was compelled by Harriet's industry and her zeal and the fact that she knew, just like we were talking about children and reading earlier, she knew that she was not being given the whole picture, that basically adults lie to children in order to preserve their innocence and in order to keep them safe. But that's not good enough. Actually, children need to find out the truth, and they will work to find out the truth no matter what kind of loving parents they have or what kind of distracted parents they have. Children will go to that job. It's essential to their emotional survival, and sometimes it's essential to their physical survival too. So I wanted to survive. I wanted to know more about the world than I knew. I wouldn't say I was an intellect, but I wasn't a slug either. I liked adventure, and spying on people was a safe adventure. So I started spying on people when I was about 13 with my spy notebook. That's what I called it. Gregory Maguire, Spy Notebook #1. Uh, and I still have it. It's in the back of the room over just out of your screenshot. And I wrote 57 journals by hand over the next like 47 years or 45 years. And I have them all, every single one. And then when my second mother died 12 years ago, I finally converted to writing on the laptop, my journal, because I was traveling back and forth to Albany enough that I needed to take care of her affairs. And it was just easier to write on a computer keyboard. But I'm still doing it. I was writing last night right before I went to bed, and I consider it my life's work, even if nobody will ever read it. It's a job of analysis, a job of perception, a job of working with language too. Just like if you're yo-yo ma, you still have to do your scales every day so that when you go into symphony hall, you can be up for the task. As a writer, I do my scales every day by writing either a journal or letters or something to keep the suppleness of my language skills at least oiled enough to be able to serve me when I need it.
I love it. And just a follow-up to that real quick is what is your reflection process with your life's work, with your Gregory Spy notebooks? Like, do you find yourself reviewing them on a regular basis? Is it something that you kind of go back to? Like, do they just exist? Like, how does that function in your life?
Well, I'll tell you, for about the first 15 years, I read them obsessively. I thought they were the most interesting piece of journalism and literature that could possibly be found. But as I began to realize I was not going to be the world's next Shakespeare or Virginia Woolf or William Faulkner, my appreciation of my own tone and my own verbal skills greatly diminished, and instead it became almost more of a psychological tool, and as I say, a writing tool, an exercise tool. But about 6 years ago, I went through the trouble of taking those 57 handwritten journals and I transcribed every page. The stack of pages, single space pages in 12-point type, I think amounts to 3,000 pages. And I transcribed them and I went back and read everything I had written about my life from the age 13 up until the month my stepmother died. And I'll tell you, it made some pretty grim reading. I was not as good a writer as I thought. Furthermore, I had great proof that how shabby and unreliable memory actually is, because I've been telling people X happened and Y happened and Z happened in that order, and then I see in my journals, oh no, Z happened before X. Are you kidding? Somebody must have gotten back in here and copied my handwriting and changed. No, it's my memory that changes things around to make a better story when I'm telling it at a dinner party or even to myself. So that's the only time I've gone back and read the whole 9 yards, and I will not do it again in this lifetime.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to checking out some of those Gregory Spy notebooks, if for nothing else, just to see like how many people you offended like Harriet did. It'll be great.
Well, you'll have to live up until the year 2070 because they are embargoed for public examination until 2070.
All right, I'm putting that in my calendar right now. So, Gregory, I when I do research on people, I really like to kind of just try to find things where I can't find a lot of detail,
Right.
or places where you've interviewed. And I apologize if you've talked about this before, but one of the things that I never knew before is that I'm not talking with Gregory Maguire. I'm talking with Dr. Maguire right now, because you have your PhD from Tufts, focused on children's fantasy from 1938 to 1989, I believe, if that's correct. And I'm kind of curious about your academic side, because you have, as a writer, and just having the luxury of heard you speak in a number of forums, like you have an academic's brain. Like it's there, and you're so good at being able to put that on a page in a very like entertaining and approachable way. But you have this whole other life where you were a professor, and you were the co-director of the Simmons College Center for Study of Children's Literature. Like, tell us a little bit about that part of your life.
It is a part of my life that has melted away like a certain wicked witch after a bucket of water. Uh, but it was a very valuable part of my life in the first half of my career. Uh, Not the academic part. I think I'm a faux academic. I can understand what I read and I can incorporate it and I can develop my own systems of thought and my own theses, and I can more or less support them up to a fashion, but they're not very obscure and they're not very elegant. And no one would ask me to, come teach at Yale, let's say. Uh, However, uh, that part of my brain that likes an intellectual question is became increasingly a serious part of being a novelist. Um, And it was about the time of the publication of Wicked that when I was, well, writing Wicked when I was about 39, that I think different parts of my brain began to cohere. Ryan, have you ever heard the conceit that our brains keep developing? It's true that the frontal lobe more or less is organized, especially in the male of the species, at about 22, 23, 25. However, there's later thinking expressed in the last 10 years or so that says, yeah, it's more or less organized at 25, but actually it keeps cohering for another 10 years. Some people don't reach what might be considered full intellectual maturity until 35 or 37 or 38, or of course, Lord knows we know some people never do. However, I remember when I was about 37 having a drink at a bar with a friend, and it was, the Merlot was making me feel weepy, but I remember getting kind of teary, and my friend who was older said, what's the matter? And I said, I just have this feeling that I have a lot more competence and a lot more depth than I have yet been able to access. And I feel it's almost like a pudding that won't set. I'm doing everything I can to make my brain serve me and serve my thoughts, but it's too roiled up. It won't work. And he said, "Oh, give yourself a break. You're even the fact that you're thinking about this means that something's happening to you." Well, that was about a year and a half before I got the idea for Wicked. And when I got the idea for Wicked, I found that so many of the things that I had apprehensions about, like about the arrangement of society, like about the value of individualism versus the value of communitarianism, like about um, the implications of scapegoating and uh, the ways in which a culture needs an enemy, a social group needs an enemy. all these things suddenly began to cohere around a story idea, and I could use everything. I could use everything that I'd ever read. I could use studies in mythology. I could use studies in literary history. I could use all my friends who were in anthropology and all the conversations I'd had around dinner parties about what actually does it mean to study a culture you don't know? What are the questions you ask, and how do you draw conclusions? All of that stuff, the pudding finally set, and I could dip my ladle into it. I could get what I needed and use it for creative ends. So when you ask about what was it like to be an academic, what I could say is its main use to me was in training my mind to be able to use what I had learned when I was finally ready to do so.
That's interesting. Like it was your gym protocol you didn't know you needed for a while.
Absolutely. And also to be very blunt, I had, like so many of us, I was insecure. I was insecure about my creative capacities. I was insecure about how smart I was. I'm from a family of smart people, and I thought, well, I'm one of the I'm one of the laggards in this group. And getting a doctorate was partly self-approval too. I said to myself, if you can do this, you're not quite as shabby as you think you are.
I mean, I think society has a series of systems that make us feel as though we're not quite there. And especially, when you're surrounded by smarter people, it's a lesson that's hard to learn sometimes, is that it's actually more beneficial to be surrounded by people that are smarter than you and that you feel, inferior toward, because it constantly is giving you a place to jump to the next hoop.
Well, absolutely. And Ryan, to go back to your question about Harriet the Spy, one of the things that I took from Harriet, one of the many wonderful quotes that have been a great guide to me during my life, is from a scene where Harriet has a nursemaid, a nanny called Old Golly, and Old Golly makes a reference to something. I don't remember what it was. And Harriet says, "What is that?" And then the narrator says, what do you mean the Renaissance? What is that? And then the next sentence after Harriet's question says, Harriet never minded asking about things she didn't understand. So what? She thought, I could always learn. Well, those two sentences, Harriet never minded asking. So what? She thought, I could always learn. When I got to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and started going to dinner parties with people with Harvard doctorates, I thought absolutely consciously, I pulled that Harriet quote from my brain to give me strength to lean across the table and say, I don't know what you mean. I don't know what Voltaire said about this. What are you talking about? Rather than pretend I knew everything that Voltaire had ever written or every attitude he had ever taken about anything. I learned to be comfortable in not knowing and in asking because I really did want to know the answer. I wanted to know the answer more than I cared about whether I appeared smart or not.
Let the record reflect publicly that both Ryan Zlomek and Gregory Maguire both agree that part of growing is admitting when you don't know something and seeking out to figure it out.
Absolutely. And I endorse that to this day. I don't mind. Or I've known something and I forget it. Okay. Well, that's one of the benefits of getting older too. You can ask again. So who was Voltaire again?
Wasn't he that guy from that Bill and Ted movie? No. So you did such a great job of lining me up to start talking about Wicked, and I greatly appreciate that.
Sure.
You had been writing children's literature, and had pretty great success from that. And I listened to one interview where you had said that you wanted to get into writing literature for adults because it paid about 10 times more. Um, and you in 1995 eventually come out with Wicked: The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. But I want to talk about things leading up to that.
Sure.
In other interviews, I've heard that you as you just pointed out, you had a series like a number of things hiding behind the dam in your brain that just had to get out.
Yeah.
But you also were living in London at the time and sort of paying attention to the way in which the media was publicizing the Gulf War and the sort of perceptions of Saddam Hussein. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you, well, first of all, just what brought you to London and how you were sort of spending your time there. And then secondly, like what were those things that you were noticing that sort of eventually lit Wicked in your brain?
Right. Well, what brought me to London in 1990 was that I had left my teaching position at Simmons College. I had finished my doctorate, but having left my teaching position, I no longer needed to stick around to see if I would get tenure. I was on tenure track and I was about to get it. And then, due to political differences with the institution at Simmons College, now university, uh, I decided to leave. And it made sense to go abroad to kind of restart myself and to try to see my life from a little bit farther away and with a different kind of atmospheric perspective, let's say. Uh, so there I was. The terms of my visa did not allow me to take a part-time job at Waterstones or Wimpy's or, Tesco supermarket. So I had to make any money that I was going to make either writing or coming back to the States and speaking, which I did a lot of it in that decade and made some decent money too. Um, I still felt a little unprepared to write a book for adults. And while it's true that I'm sure I made that statement about writing for adults pays 10 times more than writing for children, and it is generally true if you're successful enough at it. Um, in fact, that wouldn't have been the real reason. I was being glib. Uh, I've never done very much for money because I don't really care about it very much. I like having some, but it was never a motivation. Um, and so when I was living in London and feeling a little lonely for America, feeling a little lonely for my colleagues that I'd left behind in Boston, and for my family, my large family. The Gulf War started, the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, as we called it. Um, and I watched how the media, particularly the London media, London had a lot of Kuwaitis with a lot of money over on the Edgware Road area. Um, and the right-wing newspapers and the middle of the road newspapers too, I must say, called Saddam Hussein the next Hitler with a big question mark. And I remember seeing that giant headline in like 48 point type or something. I mean, it was 72 point type uh, on a rag and getting scared, thinking, oh my gosh, what if the next Hitler is here among us already, even though I'm a pacifist by nature and by moral consideration, uh, still, even pacifists sometimes have to pick up arms to defend the weak. T.H. White did it during right at the end of writing The Once and Future King. Um, so, yikes, what does this mean for me? And I did not pick up arms. I did not go join the U.S. military. But I did very soon after realize that part of my heightened blood pressure was the moral question about pacifism, but part of it was just observing the effect that Hitler had upon my limbic system. The word Hitler, a two-syllable word that is one of the scariest words in the English language, even now. Um, and I began to think about that, thinking how little a word can be and still strike fear into our hearts. At the same time that I was thinking about that and watching the first President Bush draw together a coalition of the willing to protest the actions of a military leader who most of the world considered had done an improper thing. Uh, I watched that, and at the same time or close to the same time, there was the abduction of a little boy in Liverpool and his murder by two boys. One was 10 and one was 14, I believe, who decided to skip school in the morning and by bedtime had become murderers, had killed a child, stoned him to death and left him on railroad tracks. This was such a heinous crime that everybody in England was shocked and horrified and discussed the identification of these boys uh, and their profiles, which were all published in the newspaper. And everybody was asking the question at dinner parties and in church pulpits and on talking heads shows at the end of news hour. What could bring somebody to do something, to become so wicked? Where did that come from? And that became a burning question for me. And that's really where Wicked came from. It was a combination of seeing two boys take up arms against a toddler, a lovely toddler boy, and nations take up arms against uh, another nation. And the combination of the two happening more or less at the same time, they weren't exactly identical, was such that I thought I have to write something about this or my brain is going to explode because I don't know the answers to how we decide when an action is an evil behavior and how we give ourselves the moral courage to actually get up off our pacifist couch and go train to shoot a rifle. How do we decide that? And they were moral questions and they became aesthetic questions and then they became, they became the novel Wicked. The fact that it was about the Wicked Witch of the West was really almost incidental. I was going to write a novel about Hitler and see, oh, gee, maybe my creative subconscious can tell me things about Hitler that nobody else has known yet. Well, I gave that idea up pretty fast. But when I thought about the Wicked Witch of the West, I thought, oh, she's an evil character. Wicked is even part of her name, and nobody knows anything about her. Because of my doctorate, I had read a lot of L. Frank Baum. I knew he didn't go in for backstory. She was just wicked, that's all. She was mean and she deserved to die. That was it. That's all we know about her. And I realized, that's not so unlike what those two boys did to that 2-year-old. He was crying, he got annoying, and they wanted to get rid of him. And so they did. And that was the beginning of Wicked.
It's interesting. I had the luxury of seeing you speak about 10 years ago, just south of around Binghamton area, and you had talked about the fact that you did your best to match up the timelines of the 1939 film and then of the
Yeah.
Wicked timeline, and the one thing that really stuck to me was the quote, and I'm going to butcher it, so feel free and correct me, but that in L. Frank Baum's book, Dorothy is told like you need to go kill the Wicked Witch, and she's like, "Well, why?" It's like because you must, and she's like, "Oh, on it, done."
Yeah,
Uh,
right. Yeah, exactly.
and it's just really interesting to me the way in which like that sort of fantasy element can become the vehicle you need to sort of deal with those sort of like upper level, just very adult questions that, I mean, we're in a political climate right now where everyone is dealing with these things. Everywhere you look, you cannot hide from it.
Right.
And to just have the vehicle of the Wicked Witch of the West is just a brilliant way to solve that problem.
Well, it was horrifying to me when I went back and looked at it. And the actual phrase is the wizard says, "I will send you back to Kansas if um, but you have to do something for me first." In Oz, everybody has to basically pay for what they get. No free lunches here. I'm not the Good Samaritan. You have to do something for me first. And she says, "What?" And he says, "Kill the Wicked Witch of the West." And Dorothy throws her hands back up rather prettily, I might add, and says, "Oh, but I've never killed anybody." And the wizard says, "Nonetheless, she is wicked and she deserves to die." And Dorothy then says, "On it." All he says is she's wicked, and Dorothy buys it. She swallows the whole thing. "Oh, you forgot that part. She's wicked. Oh, okay. I can kill her. I can kill her. Sure, why not? Yeah, off we go. See you around." And that was not horrifying to me as a child, but it's horrifying to me as an adult. And I know that the Wicked Witch with the capital W's is a character that Baum basically borrowed from European folklore. Now, if you know your Baum well enough, and I'm sure you do, in the introduction to, he wrote a preface to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and he said, "I aspired to write a truly American fairy tale in which all the heartache and nightmare is left out." And he did invent many figures who became iconic because he invented them, like the Tin Man and the talking Cowardly Lion and the Scarecrow. But for a villain who we were going to snuff out, he actually had to import a stereotype. It's one of the few times he succumbed to not allowing her individuality to be as real as that of a man made of tin or a scarecrow made of straw. She was simply wicked, and therefore she did deserve to be killed by Dorothy. And that's what Dorothy went and did.
Yeah. And the whole idea of like it's easier to do that when you're dealing with the other. As an author, you're importing this thing that you're saying, all right, now we can dispose of this.
Right. And Bob knew he didn't have to give her much character. I mean, he gave her more character than is generally remembered. In the book, she has one eye and she wears a patch and she has some funny rituals and some funny spells. And the way Dunsloe drew her, she's this little peg of a funny looking woman. But basically, she's a wicked witch, and that's all we really need to know in order to tolerate her being killed. She's bad enough to be killed, so it doesn't really matter what kind of life she might have had or how she got to be the way she was. I didn't think about that when I was 10 or when I was 12. Margaret Hamilton scared the pants off me. But um, but by the time I got to be adult, I thought, wait a minute, this is part of how I was shaped, was by this kind of shorthand. If we call somebody a monster, we don't have to take any time to wonder if they are actually human. If we call somebody defective, we don't have to take the time to say why. If we say this person is not like me, and therefore it's okay if I throw a stone at them or call them names or push them down the stairs because they're different. Um, we give ourselves permission to be vicious. And some fairy tales and some children's stories, which is where we get our initial rubrics of morality, allow us to do that. And I don't think that's right. And I think that's changing. But I wanted to exploit, I wanted to exploit that shorthand of the witch as being, ugh, who cares? We'll kill a witch, you know. She's a witch, who cares?
I love it. Well, thank you for going into such depth with that. The book comes out in 95, and from what I understand, on the your sales numbers are it sells pretty well and it's pretty impressive. But it's not for 8 years until it eventually makes the New York Times bestseller list.
That's true.
But I'm curious about like how I think one of the things that I read is like as soon as the book came out, people were already coming to you about buying the movie rights.
Oh, yes, it was a matter of, I think within the first week of publication, I started fielding calls from Harvard, from Hollywood, excuse me. No, Harvard never called to get the movie rights. And it was um, it was kind of astounding to me, but not 100% so, because in order to give myself guide rails to walk along this perilous path from Munchkinland to the Emerald City to the Witch's Castle out in the west. I had to, through a terrain that takes 38 years in the novel Wicked and has about 38 speaking parts of characters who recur. Uh, I had to cast the book in my mind as if it were a mini series, and so I actually I needed to be able to tell the difference between Averick and Bach and Fierro at Shiz. And so I cast them as different actors. And when I would be writing about them, I'd have, you know, Fierro was the young Antonio Banderas, like from Matador or one of those, or early movies. And Madame Horrible was Angela Lansbury and I forget who all the others. I think I had um, the wonderful Emma Thompson as Elphaba's dissolute, kind of louche mother, sleeping with every moving male part that, came down the pike. Uh, and it was easier for me to see it as a screenplay. So I did know it had narrative potential and dramatic potential, but I didn't really think of it as a movie. And I certainly did not think of it as a musical, even though I gave Elphaba Throp a very good voice and several instances in the novel where she sings 8 years before Broadway gets a hold of her. She always was a singer.
Yeah, it was really interesting kind of revisiting the book like over the last few weeks in preparation for this because there are so many parts of it where I'm just like looking at it and I was like, "Oh, like the performances in it, and there's
Yeah.
things in it. I don't want to spoil anything for people who haven't read the book, but when Elphaba utters her first word, I'm just like, that is one of the most cinematic moments in a book that I've read in a very long time. Like, it's just
Yeah.
such a nice piece. You eventually, get it in the hands of Stephen Schwartz, who kind of, takes it and molds it into the show that we know. And for people who are sort of unfamiliar with Stephen Schwartz, he had done Godspell, Pippin, and the Magic Show in the 1970s, and then had worked on some Disney properties you might know, like Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Prince of Egypt, and then is coming back to Broadway with your book in hand. And I'm curious about like your feelings about that and your relationship with that, your knowledge that somebody is going to be taking your tome and then trying to put it into something that, like, let's be honest, is fairly accessible to the public in a way. Like, I'm very curious about sort of where your headspace was at once you knew it was in the hands of Stephen Schwartz.
Sure. I will correct a sentence you spoke at the beginning of your question, though, is I didn't get it into the hands of Stephen Schwartz. He got his hands on it. I mean, I didn't shop it around trying to, see if I could get anybody interested in it. Once the book was published, it had its own life trajectory, and I had very little to do about what happened to it next, except to answer questions when my agent would call and say, China wants to publish it, and somebody's asking about an animated cartoon series. And, I would answer questions, but I didn't go out and try to farm it um, to plant it to produce further crops. But I know that's incidental, but I think it's important for people who are thinking about how do you move in the world when you have a property that ends up having potential like that. Nonetheless, when the book was published, within about a year, I had signed a contract with Demi Moore and Universal Studios for a non-musical film version. Uh, I had three adopted children, all of whom were under the age of 6, and the possibility that I might be able to earn some money and pay off the mortgage on our home was very exciting to me, because who ever knows as an author whether you're ever going to make any more money again in your life. Uh, and so I wanted a movie to be made, and I wanted to get the purchase price for the book, which would have been able to pay off my mortgage back then. Uh, but I wasn't happy, and nor was Universal, with the scripts that were being developed of a non-musical film. They were being developed more for a child's audience. I'd say something like Paddington Bear. It was for that demographic. Nothing wrong with that demographic, and I go to children's movies all the time, but it's not exactly what Wicked, the novel, was about. And I was willing to just keep my mouth shut and bite my tongue and collect the check and go with a paper bag over my head and deposit it at my bank and pay off my mortgage and have that be the end of it. But Hollywood, Mark Platt at Universal, wasn't happy with the script either. And this was a little bit before the arrival of Harry Potter on the stage of the world, and of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, and of Philip Pullman, The Golden Compass. Actually, Philip Pullman and I were almost simultaneous. But putting a lot of money toward a fantasy film was a little scary at that point. And Universal wasn't sure that they had a good enough script to warrant bankrolling it. That's when Stephen Schwartz came in and went to Mark Platt and said, I understand you can't get a good shooting script, and I can tell you why. It's because ever since 1939, everyone in the universe knows that people in Oz sing. This has to be a singing vehicle first, and then you can make a movie of it. Mark Platt said, well, works for me. Everybody in Hollywood is seeing how much money Disney is making with its Broadway shows. Put it on Broadway, but you'll have to convince the author first, because he's the one who has the right of refusal about this project. And frankly, the money to be earned from a Broadway show is nowhere in the same league as the money we would have paid to option the novel for a big budget movie. So good luck. So Stephen Schwartz came to see me, and we went for a walk, and he made a couple of arguments about why it would be a better play first, and then a movie could be made later. Uh, and he was persuasive. I have a kind of a Scottish Presbyterian demeanor, and I didn't, grin my face off over the notion of a Broadway musical being based on my book, but I was pretty happy. And when he told me that, he got a little nervous because I was, as any in any negotiation, you don't give your hand away. I was saying, tell me more, and he was thinking, well, maybe this isn't going to work. And he said, I'm so convinced you're going to see the rightness of my idea that I'm going to confess to you, I've already conceived of the first song. It's going to be called No One Mourns the Wicked. No one mourns the wicked. And with those 5 words, he sealed the deal in my heart. Because with those 5 words, he let me know he understood the moral reasons I had written the book and the moral questions I wanted to pose. And I thought, whatever else he and his team does with this, as long as they respect the moral underpinnings of the story, I don't even care if the plot changes. What I care is that the concepts and the themes don't change. And the reason that I wrote the book, having to do with the death of Jamie Bulger and international alliances of military might, are still capable of being seen in the bones of a musical play. And I think they are. And I gave him my credit, my blessing. He wrote the musical with the great Winnie Holtzman doing the libretto, as it were, doing the book of the musical. And Stephen Schwartz wrote the lyrics. Uh, and I'm very happy with it and maintain happiness with it and delighted with the movie of it. Because Mark Platt was right. Eventually, they were going to make a movie of it. They thought it might be about 5 years after the play, but in fact, the play became such an astonishing, unanticipated, roaring juggernaut of a success that they could afford to wait and really take their time until they felt they had all their ducks in a row and had the raw material to make it the best possible movie it could be. And I think part one anyway, is the best possible movie it could be. I love it.
I love it. And, for listeners out there, you've had a chance to see it for 2 weeks, and poor Ryan Zlomek here has to wait a few days. So you're ahead of me on this. Uh, but, it's one of the things I was really curious about, Gregory, is oftentimes, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep reflecting on it. Hey, remember that one time we talked before
It's
and you said
okay.
this other thing? But, the comparison that you drew, and this is years before the movie was in the works, was the idea that like when Anne Rice had to see Interview with the Vampire come out, she basically rents an entire page on the New York Times just to say like this movie's terrible, don't go see it, I have nothing to do with it, blah blah blah. And of course the movie is still remarkably successful. You, on the other hand, have been somebody that has been a cheerleader for this, dare I say, franchise. And,
Yep.
like, despite the fact that, you wrote it in your seclusion, like the life that it has taken is something that you've like been there with your sort of magic carpet on the sidelines. And now that you're at a point where like, Wicked is not only, what did I just read, the fourth longest running Broadway musical show of all time, and
Yeah.
now this movie's coming out that everybody's very excited about, and I've seen you take selfies with Ariana Grande and Jeff Goldblum,
Yeah.
and all those things, but also like there's Starbucks beverages, and you can't go to Target without seeing your characters.
I'm
You know,
sorry. I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm sorry.
I love it. Please continue to pollute my world with goodness. But But I'm just curious about how that feels to like, at least at this moment in time where we're in this like pre-release where there's just so much material. How does it feel to just see this seed that you planted really gestate into this like gargantuan thing?
It is a cause for me to keep, a psychotherapist on auto dial. It's a bit, it is a bit daunting. I'm very lucky that success of this sort did not come to me until middle age when I'd had, good part of my life, eating lentils and relying on the kindness of strangers almost the first half of my career. And in the second half of my career, my children were in my house, and their needs were always much more important than my ego gratification. And even though my children are now all in their 20s, their needs are still more important than mine. So they might want to go to Starbucks and get Wicked drinks, and they do. And they ask me if I want anything, and I say, no, thank you. I've had quite enough. I like Starbucks, but you get the Wicked drinks. I'll just stay home and have, a bourbon.
It's great, and I just even to just expand upon it. You've talked about the origin of the name Elphaba in so
Right.
many other interviews that I think it's okay for me to point out that L. Frank Baum wrote the Wizard of Oz books, and LFB Elphaba was the sort of origin of the name of that character. But just the fact that like that is now part of our cultural vernacular, where people
Yeah.
just comfortably say like, "Oh, remember when they threw water at Elphaba?" Like it's just the name that's been applied to this
Yeah.
character from here on out.
It is bizarre. And the analogy for me in that is J.M. Barrie having written Peter Pan, the play, and then Peter Pan and Wendy, which was the name of the novel that he wrote after, based on the play. That novel eventually just became known as Peter Pan too. But in 1900 or 1901, just about the same time that L. Frank Baum was doing The Wizard of Oz, uh, J.M. Barrie invented the name Wendy. It wasn't a name before. And the play was so popular and her character was so appealing that little girls started being named Wendy. And I've known several Wendy's in my life. And in 1898, there were no Wendy's listed in any baptismal registers anywhere in the world. J.M. Barrie had to invent that. I don't think there's going to be a slew of baby Elphabas myself. I intentionally, I thought of Wendy quite, I mean, quite concretely. I thought I can't give her a name that is pretty and is going to be uh, adopted or co-opted, because she's a witch and she's spiky and thorny and difficult. But I have to give her a name that is memorable and that is easy enough to say. So that's where I came up with Elphaba. It's not particularly a pretty word, but it has overtones of words like fabulous and alphabet, like for magic spell. Um, what I didn't anticipate, Ryan, was that I thought it would be very clear how the name was pronounced. But after the book was out, once my agent called me, and this was after I got a surprisingly, large royalty check. Or maybe I called him and said, I think there must be a mistake. I mean, I've never earned this kind of money. And he said, with all the trust and belief in me that he always expressed, he said, yeah, I thought there was a mistake too. And I actually called the publisher to see if somebody had added an extra zero or maybe even two onto your royalty check, which is not the kind of royalty check I usually send you. And he said, but it's correct. The book is not on the bestseller list, but it's a sleeper and it's already finding its way and selling thousands of copies. But slowly, just slowly and steadily. The more people read it, the more they recommend it, and it's just selling. Uh, he said, who could have known that your little green Elphaba, could have done this for us? And I thought, Elphaba? Are you nuts? But then I realized I had never said how it should be pronounced. It's like, now one of the first things when Stephen Schwartz and Mark Platt, got onto the script, one of the few things they actually asked me was how the names were pronounced. And I said, it's very important. It's Elphaba with stress on the first syllable, exactly the way it is in the names Dorothy and Margaret and Hamilton for that matter. Elphaba, stress on the first syllable. But I never said that in the book, so Elphaba she is to some communities.
It is funny because in the book you do go out of your way to say it's Galinda.
Yes, it's true.
I love it. Well, Mark, you've been so generous with your time, and I really appreciate you beaming into Syracuse, New York from Massachusetts. We're
Yeah,
waving at Albany in between both of us. Um, I just a couple quick wrap up questions.
sure.
The first one is that well, I guess I'll pump this up real quick, which is that you have Elfie, A Wicked Childhood that's going to be coming out in March. Um,
Right.
which is really exciting. And actually, I'll backpedal and say that at this time, especially as we're thinking about the holiday season, there's an awesome four-book box set for Wicked, and there's also a what did you call it? A collected hardcover edition of Wicked with green. What are they doing with
Green
it?
is green paper edging. So, when the book is closed and you hold it up, you see green ink on the top, the side, and the bottom of the pages. It's a collector's edition and it has a black ribbon so you can mark your place in the text and go back to it. And it's beautifully bound and beautifully reset. I think it's reset in type, but it's beautifully re-inked. So if you never cared for the fact that the ink sometimes grayed out a little bit in the original, this one is inked perfectly all the way through. That kind of thing really means something to me. So yeah, those two things are available you know in the holiday markets around the nation. And but Elfie, the new book, will be out in March, about 3.5 or 4 months from when we're recording this, and it is drawn on several small scenes that were extracts from the original novel Wicked, written 30 years ago, that I had to remove because the book needed to be a little shorter than it was. But I was always sorry about removing. And I also, back to where we started about what does childhood do for us as it builds us strength and sets us challenges to become the adults we need to become. The same is true of Elphaba too. I wanted 2 or 3 short scenes between her infancy and her going to college that could show her in the kind of stress situations that all children find themselves in. Uh, and we had to jettison them because of length and because of the cost of paper. But I never liked that. And so now I have satisfied, before I leave this vale of tears, um, to go over the rainbow or anyplace else, or, under the highway. Um, I think I wanted to make sure that my picture of what her childhood must have been like is out there, even if the intellectual property has to some extent escaped me now. It's gone off my property. Other people have ownership of a lot of it and have some say in what happens downstream from here. In the same way that I had no, uh, I had no real say in what happened in the movie, what changes they were going to make. Not only did I have no say, I wasn't told either. I went and I saw it, when it was released for other people to see. And that's fine with me, but I still have Elfie in my Elfie comes from my heart and comes from my head and my set of concerns, and I wanted to give her childhood to the world before somebody else did.
I love it. Well, three quick rapid fire questions for you before
Sure.
we go on. The first one is, for people who are interested in kind of getting to know more about what you're doing, do you have any places online for them to visit?
Well, I do have a website, www.gregorymaguire.com, and that's Maguire spelled like that old movie Jerry Maguire, if you remember that, Maguire.com.
Awesome. Show him the money, please. Number two is I always want to leave space at the end of the show, just if there's anything we haven't tackled or any ideas that you want to kind of float. Is there anything that you'd like to put out there?
I will say this, Ryan, and I'm not a person who brings my social or my political concerns to the forefront generally when talking about art. But if art does anything, it exists in order to console us and challenge us, to remind us not only of who we are, but of who we might become. I mean that both negatively and positively. We might become monsters. We might become capable of being assassins and of killing somebody. Art sharpens the focus on the most important moral questions of our brief time on this earth. And so I think that if Wicked still has something to say 30 years after it is published, it is that we must be very, very careful about how we use the strength that we find in our forearms and in our tongues and in our spirits. We must be very careful to marshal it and to use it wisely.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. And my last question for you, just I've had the luxury of interviewing a lot of people, and I'm not sure I've ever had the privilege of spending time with somebody who is so focused on words and the origins of words and the history of words and the way words or meanings have translated over time. So I had one quick word question for you, which is
Sure.
um, researching your family. You're married to Andy Newman, and your three kids, Luke, Alex, and Helen, used to call Andy Dada and you Ba. And I was curious if, now that your kids are still in their 20s, they're getting older, if you're still the Ba of the household.
I am the ba of the household, and that word is a Khmer word for father, for daddy. I actually thought that when we went to collect our first child from Phnom Penh, I introduced myself as Daddy Ba because I thought I would be called Daddy the way I called my father Daddy. And the child, I thought, well, the child will drop the ba and just call me daddy, but he didn't. He dropped the daddy and called me ba. And when a 1.5-year-old calls you by your name, you answer. You don't pretend you don't hear him because it's the wrong name. So I've been ba ever since, and that was a decision of our oldest sons. I'm ba to the whole family, and Andy is dada. Yes.
Well, Ba, it's been an honor to interview you. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you, Ryan. Enjoy life out there in the beautiful area of Chittenango and a part of New York I love very well. And maybe our paths will cross again.
I hope so. Thanks so much. This has been an absolute joy.
Take care. Bye bye.
Gregory Maguire, what an absolute gem of a human, a gentleman, a scholar, and someone willing to make space for conversation. I can't even begin to describe how elated I am from that chat. And listeners at home, I really hope that you found that beneficial and are just so excited to dig into the history of these stories. When I started doing my research, I remember little bits of the way in which Wicked had sort of come together, but really just hearing it from him, understanding the way in which we can take something that is so terrible and all consuming and difficult to manage and then manifest it into something that can, help us shift our perspective and create positive change in the world. That's the beauty of art, and I really do think that his novel Wicked and the life that it has taken on is a testament to that very idea. So if you're somebody at home who is listening to this and is excited to learn a little bit more about the Wicked Witch of the West, go check out some of Gregory's books. You will not be disappointed. On Meditations, we have another literary great coming on the show. On December 18th, New York Times bestselling author Grady Hendrix will be coming on the show. And if you're unfamiliar with the work of Grady Hendrix, he is somebody who manages to write horror novels of all things and put a tremendous amount of heart behind them. Not only heart, but also a significant amount of research that can help us turn the tropes of horror on their head. So he is the writer of Horror Store, which is an IKEA horror novel. True story. Think about prefabricated furniture and all the things that terrify you about that. He wrote My Best Friend's Exorcism, which was also turned into a film on Amazon Prime. Paperbacks from Hell, which is an amazing collection of a study of horror paperbacks and the absurdity of the types of narratives that were feeding into the base reader in the 1980s. He wrote the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, We Sold Our Souls, and his new book, Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, which will be coming out in 2025. So if you are interested in some more literary background, Grady Hendrix, who is quite the performer, we're going to talk about theater, that theme is going to keep coming back, is going to be on the show on December 18th. If you want to take a step back in time and you need some more fun, exciting, and engaging conversations in your life, don't hesitate to take a look at the back catalog of Meditations with Ryan Zlomek. If you need more Oz, episode 11, we have Emmy Award winner and Judy Garland historian John Fricke on the show. On episode 2, we talk with Nick Parisi, who's a historian, about Rod Serling, the creator of The Twilight Zone. On episode 27, I talk with novelist Soma Mae Chung Fraser about her latest novel, Off the Books, which has been making waves since it was released this summer. And we've got episode 31 with Henri Houston, who is a media executive for Netflix and formerly worked for HBO. Equally, if you're interested in any of my work, you can find me at Ryan Zlomek on Instagram and TikTok. You can find the World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook. You can email me meditations@ryanzlomek.com. Or you can, search through the rest of my library and see if anything appeals to you. If you really like what you hear, though, your support means a lot. Subscriptions, reviews, sharing it, that's how these conversations grow. So if you like what's going on, give a shout out. It means a lot. But most importantly, make sure you pass on this sort of open-mindedness in your daily lives. I dare you to. Because if we make space for conversation, we just might learn something. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you have an amazing, fantastic, and Ozical week.